Monday, November 7th. On the first day of school after George was hit by Sam Baines's car, Lorraine is infatuated with George as a result of the Florence Nightingale effect. With his attentions focused on Lorraine, George stops writing science fiction stories, and having missed science fiction theater on the 5th, due to his injury, apparently has no problem missing the show scheduled for Saturday, the 12th, the night of the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. George then asks Lorraine to the dance, and she accepts. Biff, meanwhile, apparently leaves them alone for a while. Tuesday, November 8th. Biff and his gang stop by Lou's Cafe to make sure that George McFly isn't there, then drive off, perhaps commenting on a manure truck that is parked nearby. Saturday, November 12th. Doc continues to think about the vision he had had a week earlier about the flux capacitor. If Doc is conducting an experiment, it is probably in his home rather than in Courthouse Square. Lorraine, accompanied by her friend Babs, goes to Ruth's frock shop in downtown Hill Valley to pick up a dress she had made for the dance later that night. There is nobody else present. The Enchantment Under the Sea dance takes place at the Hill Valley High School gym. Marvin Berry and the Starlighters play a set of music, taking a break at 9 o'clock. Biff and his gang spend the evening drinking, but avoid going to the dance. During Marvin Berry and the Starlighters' second, and final for the night, set, George and Lorraine share their first kiss on the dance floor. It is at that moment that Lorraine realizes that she is going to spend the rest of her life with George. 10:04 p.m., the Hill Valley Courthouse is struck by lightning, stopping its clock after 70 years, 2 months, 7 days, 2 hours and 4 minutes of continuous ticking. Despite repeated attempts over the intervening years, the clock is never successfully repaired. In fact, most Hill Valley residents voice a desire for its preservation, as is to memorialize the unusual occurrence. 1956. Date unknown. The youngest Baines sibling is born to Sam and Stella Baines. Name and sex are never mentioned, but Stella is visibly pregnant in November 1955. Date unknown. Lyon Estates, the future home of George and Lorraine McFly and their kids in 1985, is completed. Wednesday, June 20th. George McFly and Lorraine Baines McFly graduate from Hill Valley High School. 1957. Date unknown. Toyota begins exports to the U.S. market. Earliest possible date for Statler Motors to take on the franchise. 23. 1958. Monday, March 31st. Chuck Berry releases the single Johnny B. Good. 24. Thursday, March 27th. Biff Tannen turns 21, the legal gambling age. 25. Sunday, December 7th. George McFly and Lorraine Baines get married. 1960s. Date unknown. George McFly and Lorraine Baines' earliest possible time for them to move to Lyon Estates. 1962. Wednesday, August 1st. Doc Brown's mansion is destroyed by fire, except for the detached garage, which Doc moves into. 26. Date unknown. Doc sells off the rest of the land. 26. 1963. Date unknown. Tab, which Marty will ask for in Timeline 2 and onward, is introduced. 27. Date unknown. Dave McFly is born to George and Lorraine McFly. 1964. Date unknown. Riverside Drive, the street of Doc Brown's residence, is renamed John F. Kennedy Drive in honor of the recently assassinated United States President. 1966. Date unknown. Linda McFly is born to George and Lorraine McFly. Date unknown. Studebaker halts all remaining automobile production. 28. The Statler Motors dealership has switched to selling Toyota cars by then. 1967. Wednesday, January 18th. A Fistful of Dollars, starring Clint Eastwood, is released to USCIN. Marty's boss in 2015. 1976 to 1977. Date unknown. 8-year-old Marty accidentally sets fire to the living room rug. His parents don't go easy on him in this timeline. 31. 1980s. 1981. Date unknown. The DeLorean car that Doc Brown ends up buying it. Manufactured. Date unknown. Biff Tannen Jr. is born to Biff Tannen and an unknown woman. 1982. Date unknown. Pepsi Free, the drink Marty tries to order in 1955, in Timeline 2 and onward, is introduced. 32. 1983. Date unknown. Marty and Doc meet and become friends. According to the original Part 1 script, Doc shows up at Marty's house and hires Marty to sweep his garage in the year 1983. Doc gave Marty total access to his record collection, and they became friends. Sunday, May 22nd, Ronald Reagan announces he will run for a second term in office. Although a newspaper headline, seen in Timeline 2, mentions that Doc Brown is commended and wins an award, it is unknown whether this happened in the original timeline, because in 1985, Dr. Brown is described by Stanford S. Strickland as a real nutcase. 1984. June, Linda McFly graduates in the class of '84. 1985. Libyan terrorists steal plutonium from the local power plant so Doc can build them a nuclear weapon. 21. It is dismissed by the FBI as a simple clerical error. 33. Friday, October 25th. 8:18 a.m. Opening titles of Back to the Future. All the clocks in Doc's lab are set 25 minutes slow, displayed incorrectly as 7:53 a.m. 8:25 a.m. Doc asks Marty to meet him at Twin Pines Mall at 1:15 a.m. next morning. Marty arrives to school late, then fails his audition with his band, the Pinheads, later after school. Marty admires a black Toyota Hilux 4x4 on a flatbed truck at the Texaco gas station. A woman asks Marty for a donation to preserve the non-functioning clock tower, handing him a flyer containing specific date and time details about the lightning strike to the clock. Marty puts the flyer in his pocket. Biff borrows George's car. He crashed. Emmett Brown. Explore properties. September 5th. After fitting the DeLorean with flanged steel railroad wheels, Doc uses a makeshift model railroad to demonstrate to Marty the plan on getting them back to the future. Immediately after, Clara arrives, asking Doc to repair her telescope, which had been damaged when it fell off the wagon during the rescue the day before. Doc, agreeing to perform the repair job without charge, becomes even more smitten with her. Evening. Although Doc Brown is never the central focus of Back to the Future, his actions often drive the story, and his journey as he bounces around in time runs the full gamut of human experience, from falling in love and having children to dying, twice, although not necessarily in that order. While Doc's timeline does overlap with Marty's quite a bit, they're not entirely the same, and tracing Doc's trajectory through the movies leads to some interesting places, splitting into 7 separate timelines. To make sense of them, we'll start when Doc first invented time travel, and then follow him as he begins to jump back and forth through time. Timeline A. Doc Brown gets the idea for time travel. There would be no Back to the Future trilogy without the invention of time travel, and there would be no invention of time travel without, appropriately enough, a clock. On November 5th, 1955, Doc Brown decided to hang a clock over the toilet in his bathroom, and the rest was history, and the future, and alternate history, and alternate futures. While balancing on his toilet, Doc fell and hit his head, knocking him unconscious. When he came to, he'd had a vision of the flux capacitor, the device that makes time travel possible. We don't know how long Doc spent translating his vision into reality, but sometime over the following 30 years, he was successful in creating a working flux capacitor, which he then set about installing in a DeLorean. Meanwhile, on November 12th, a week after falling off his toilet, while Doc was likely still trying to make sense of his bathroom epiphany, the clock tower at the Hill Valley Courthouse was struck by lightning. At the time, this event didn't seem related to Doc's tumble off his toilet, but eventually, they'd wind up inextricably linked. Timeline: A Doc meets his doom. 3 decades after inventing the flux capacitor, Doc finishes his time machine, but there's just one small hitch in testing it out. In order to run, his machine requires 1.21 gigawatts, perplexingly pronounced gigawatt in the film, of power, which is significantly more than your average car battery can produce. Doc's solution? Just juice up the car with a little plutonium. Of course, as Marty points out, plutonium is hardly something you can just buy at the store, but Doc has an answer for that, too. In a totally foolproof plan, Doc makes a deal with a group of Libyan terrorists to build them a bomb, steals their plutonium, and gives them a bomb casing filled with used pinball machine parts. What can possibly go wrong? Turns out, quite a bit. In October 1985, Doc asks Marty to come help him document the first test of his time machine in the parking lot of the Twin Pines Mall, but no sooner has he conducted a successful test with his dog, Einstein, than the Libyans show up, incensed that Doc has stolen their plutonium. Marty hides, but Doc knows he's been found and braces for his fate. Sure enough, the terrorists open fire and kill Doc as a traumatized Marty looks on. Marty then tries to escape in the DeLorean, still programmed by Doc for the day he first invented time travel, bringing him back to November 5, 1955. Timeline: B. Marty meets Doc Brown back in 1955. Not long after receiving his vision of the flux capacitor and bandaging the bump on his head, Doc Brown has just decided to test out his latest mind-reading invention when there's a knock on his door. When he opens it, a kid named Marty is standing there, claiming to be from the future, and asking for Doc's help returning to 1985. At first, Doc doesn't believe him, but not only does Marty know how Doc got the bump on his head, but he's carrying a videotape that shows a much older version of Doc himself, purportedly testing out a time machine. Convinced, Doc decides to help Marty hatch a plan to get him back to the future. Doc is initially stumped by the power requirements of the time machine, saying the only thing capable of producing the necessary 1.21 gigawatts is a bolt of lightning, but Marty then informs him that he does, in fact, know exactly when and where lightning will strike the Hill Valley Courthouse clock tower on the evening of November 12, 1955. Timeline: B. Doc sends Marty back to the future. Over the course of the next week, November 6th to 12th, 1955, Doc spends much of his time making models of the town and fine-tuning his plan to harness a bolt of lightning into the flux capacitor. Due to the tight deadline and much to his chagrin, Doc doesn't have time to paint his model or make it fully to scale, but somehow, he muddles through. While Doc is trying to make sure all the pieces are in place to get Marty back to the future, a wrench is thrown into his carefully laid plans when he realizes that Marty has accidentally bungled the timeline, preventing his parents from ever falling in love. Horrified at the temporal implications of what Marty has done, Doc assists Marty in making sure his parents get together before Marty is erased from existence. After successfully matchmaking Marty's parents, Doc and Marty prepare to channel the imminent lightning strike into the DeLorean, but before Marty climbs into the car, he tries to give Doc a letter predicting his future. Furious about the possible effects that knowing his own future could have on the space-time continuum, Doc refuses to read the letter and rips it up. Marty is clearly upset, but he doesn't have time to argue. Lightning strikes, Doc's plan is successful, and Marty disappears in the DeLorean. Timeline: B. Marty's note saves the day. We don't know how long Doc carries around the ripped-up pieces of Marty's letter, but eventually, he decides to tape the torn scraps of paper back together, and reads what Marty wrote. When he does, he learns that on the night Marty travels back to the future, Doc will be shot and killed by terrorists. In the letter, Marty urges Doc to take whatever precautions are necessary to prevent this terrible disaster. Doc takes Marty's advice to heart, although it doesn't stop him from stealing from terrorists. This time, when Doc goes to the mall to test his time machine, he wears a bulletproof vest underneath his coveralls and survives the shooting. When Marty asks him what made him change his mind about the disastrous implications for the space-time continuum, Doc gives him an extremely scientific explanation. I decided, what the hell? Having survived his formerly fatal encounter with the terrorists, Doc decides his next trip in the time machine should be to the future. On October 26, 1985, accompanied by his dog, Einstein, Doc sets out for the year 2015. Timeline be taking a trip to 2015. When Doc first arrives in 2015, everything about the future seems great. Cars are flying, clothing is self-adjusting, and movie theaters project holograms out into the street. Doc takes full advantage of the advanced technology of the future, placing Einstein in a suspended animation kennel while he modifies the DeLorean with a hover conversion and adds a Mr. Fusion home energy reactor to circumvent the need for plutonium. He also goes shopping for new clothes, picks up a sleep-inducing alpha rhythm generator, and visits a rejuvenation clinic to receive an all-natural overhaul, which promises to add 30 to 40 years to his life. To steal the sports almanac from Biff in order to restore the timeline. While there, they also have to work to avoid their Timeline A and B counterparts, who are still living through the events of 1955 Timeline B. Doc is sure that if they encounter themselves in the past, it could have disastrous implications on the space-time continuum. Sponsored by Ketel 1. Real botanicals, fresh taste. Read more. Marty is ultimately successful in retrieving the sports almanac from Biff, grabbing it from the bully's car while riding on a hoverboard after a medium-speed chase. Marty narrowly avoids a potentially fatal crash when Doc drops a rope down to him from the flying DeLorean and pulls him to safety. Doc then tells Marty to burn the almanac, which he does, and they confirm that the timeline is restored. However, before Doc can land the DeLorean and pick up Marty to return to 1985, the car is struck by lightning, causing the time circuits to go haywire and transport him to 1885. Back in 1955, the Timeline E version of Doc helps Marty figure out how to repair the DeLorean so that Marty can go after him. This version of Doc also dresses Marty in a truly unfortunate cowboy outfit so that he'll fit in when he travels back to the Wild West. After realizing what's happened, and that the DeLorean has been so damaged by the lightning strike that there's no hope of repairing it enough to return to the future, Doc resigns himself to remaining in 1885. First, he hides the DeLorean in a cave, and he leaves a letter with the Western Union for Marty, telling him how to fix the time machine so he can return to the future. Doc gives the Postal Service extremely specific instructions to hold the letter for 70 years, then to deliver it to the person they'll find at a precise location, at a precise date and time. Satisfied that Marty will be okay, Doc begins building a life for himself. He becomes a blacksmith, using his futuristic scientific know-how to invent things like a mechanical refrigerator. After establishing himself in town, Doc is asked to pick up the new schoolteacher, Clara Clayton, Mary Steenburgen, from the train station, and the two quickly fall in love. Tragically though, not long after meeting Clara, Doc shoes a horse for Buford Mad Dog Tannen, which later throws Tannen off, causing him to break a $5 bottle of whiskey. Tannen shoots the horse, which he values at $75, and demands Doc pay for both. Doc refuses, and in retaliation, Mad Dog shoots him in the back, killing him. Timeline G. Marty travels to 1885 to save Doc's life. After leaving the DeLorean for Marty, and becoming a blacksmith, but before meeting Clara, Doc rescues Marty from Mad Dog and his gang. They were going to hang him, partially because of the outfit that 1955 timeline Doc picked out for him. Initially, Doc is irritated that Marty traveled back for him, rather than returning to 1985 as he instructed, but after learning about his death in Timeline F, he agrees to return with Marty. Sponsored video. Read more.